To welcome everybody back. I hope you guys had enough time to go get some food and get on back here. So thank you guys for returning for the second half. Before we get started, just a couple of shopkeeping announcements, a couple of business things. First off, again, we really want to keep in touch. We have a whole series. We've been doing events like this now for the past several years, and we really want to get the word out to as many people as possible. So out there on the back table, if you leave early, please stop by, fill out. There's a questionnaire, things that we can always be doing to try to make these programs better for you. But also on those questionnaires, there's not a spot for it, but please put your email address, because we'd like to keep in touch with everybody so that we can continue to keep you posted as to our future events. And one of them I know we've talked about before, but on October 8th here, we're hosting a young lady by the name of Alyssa Childers. And Alyssa Childers is an absolutely dynamic speaker, has got a great story. She basically ran afoul of what is sometimes considered to be progressive Christianity. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the recent phrase of many people deconstructing their faith. And that's kind of what she speaks on, and she is bright, she is dynamic, she is passionately, you know her, somebody you really, really would love to hear. She's got a very compelling story and a lot of great information that we need to know, because there's changes not just outside the church, there's changes going on inside the church that we need to be aware of and we need to know how to respond to. So Alyssa Childers, October 8th, love to have you guys here. Another piece of shopkeeping information, just I could tell that many of you are really enjoying this conference and you're enjoying the information that you're getting, and it's excellent. There are a number of programs that do this kind of thing on a regular basis, and several of them are focused on young people. So if anybody in this room is somewhere between the ages of 16 and 22, these programs are for you guys. If anybody in this room cares about anybody who's from ages 16 to 22, which is about everybody here, you really should be aware of these programs. We've put some flyers out on the table, but I want to just really quickly describe some of these programs for you. There's one called Summit Ministries. Summit Ministries is a 2-week program. They have events in Georgia and in Colorado, and it's 2 weeks of intensive Christian worldview training, just kind of like you're getting here from Lee. They bring in some of the top speakers across the nation to come in and talk to young people, to challenge them, because our world is changing, and it is changing dramatically. And young people especially are right in the bullseye of that change. And these programs help our young people to be able to understand what's going on in the culture, what's going on in the world, how God's word speaks to those changes, and what we can do to try to respond to them in a Christ-like manner filled with both grace and with truth, because we have to have both. So Summit Ministries, I've sent many of my kids to that. It's excellent. There's another one very similar called Impact 360, which is also down in Georgia. It's a 1-week program. Again, some of the top people who are trained in teaching worldview, teaching evangelism, work with young people. Small numbers, so you get a lot of personal attention. And then there's a program called Student Leadership University, which is targeted for high school, college-age students. It's a 4-year program. And it's a week or two every summer. Their first week is in Orlando, learning about Christian leadership from a Christian perspective. The second year is in Washington, D.C., where you tour Capitol, you meet with the Senate chaplain, you meet with certain members of Congress. Again, learning about government, about the history of our nation, and how to filter that through the Christian worldview. The third year is in Europe, where you go to Normandy, Paris, London, Oxford. It's an amazing experience. Again, several of my kids have gone through this. My wife and I, we took advantage to go with our son to Europe, and it was amazing teaching, a fabulous time. And then the 4th year is in Israel. So these are really, really good programs to know about. There's information at the back table. Please take them. Think about going to these places, because this kind of training is essential for our young people today. And again, grandparents, parents, encourage your kids, encourage your grandkids to take advantage of these programs because they are outstanding. One more just to kind of talk to you about from adult perspective. There is a program, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with a gentleman named Chuck Coulson, but Chuck Coulson was a dramatic Christian leader, passed away about 10 years ago. There is an organization called the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, which does a lot of outstanding work, again, looking at what's going on in our world, and then how do we as followers of Christ respond to these changes in a way that is biblically sound, again, showing love, showing compassion, but never compromising on truth. And the Colson program has something called a Colson Fellows program, which is basically a 10-month deep dive into worldview, where you look at things like sexuality, you look at other religious traditions such as Islam, you look at a whole number of cultural hotspots, and again, you meet with a group of like-minded people over these 10 months, and you train each other, you learn together. I've got a Colson fellow right here who went through it, and what do you think? Life-changing. So these programs are excellent. There's flyers out there on the Colson program. I took the program 2 years ago. I led a cohort last year. I'm leading a cohort this year. So I'd love to talk to anybody who would be interested in doing this program. Again, life-changing, outstanding. Everybody who did it comes back. In fact, I think half the people who went through our program last year are involved again this year, training more people. That's how impactful that is.
And it's virtual, right?
Well, there's the cohort I'm leading is online. So you don't have a lot of traveling to do. You can just do it online on your computer, a lot of reading, a lot of good information, a lot of webinars. Again, you're being taught by some of the brightest minds in the Christian worldview arena. People like Lee, you've been involved in it. So again, these are excellent programs. There's information back there. We'd love to talk to you about it. If you have any questions, please reach out and grab us. And with that being said, Lee, you're up.
Yeah, I want to second everything Dr. Burgess said. All of those are tremendous opportunities. Alyssa Childers, who's coming October 8th, I wrote the foreword to her new book. She's terrific. How many of you ever heard of a music group, a Christian music group years ago, maybe 10 years ago, named Zoe Girl? I mean, yeah, she was part of that group. I think she was a drummer, if I'm not mistaken. But she's brilliant. Her new book, Another Gospel, is wonderful. And all these programs that Dr. Burr mentioned are just outstanding. Another program I'll mention briefly is the one that I talked about earlier, the Strobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics at Colorado Christian University. I had several conversations with people over the day about our certificate program. And this is for people that don't want another degree. It's not as academic an experience. It's more a very practical experience. It's all online. You do it at your own pace. And you could take a course on how to do evangelistic small groups like we talked about this morning, or any one of 36 other courses. So I got on the phone during the break, and I called Colorado Christian University. I said, hey, I got a bunch of friends here who may be interested in doing this. What can you do? So they said, okay, if anybody in this room wants to take a certificate course, we'll give you a 40% discount. All you have to do is use the code Virginia22. Virginia 22, and you'll be able to get it, which brings the price down to about $40. These are not expensive. Now, if you want to get a certificate, you can get a whole certificate. That is 6 courses. You take 6 of these courses, and you get a certificate. And it can be a certificate in innovative evangelism, practical apologetics, world religions, or cultural apologetics. So if you take 6 courses, if you're thinking about doing that and getting a certificate, use a different code. Use Virginia Cert, C-E-R-T 22, Virginia Cert 22. You have to do this in the next few days, just so they don't lose track of all this stuff. So anyway, I encourage you, if you want to grow in these areas, it's a great opportunity. So this session, I want to talk about the case for the Gospels, the case for the reliability of the Gospels. You know, one of the fun things I get to do in my writing is I get to travel around and interview scholars and experts. And I love doing that, but I especially like interviewing the skeptics and the atheists that I get to interview. And so for my book, for instance, Case for Faith, how many have read The Case for Faith? Anybody? Yeah, a few. And you know the story there of Charles Templeton, who was the #1 skeptic in Canada, who wrote a very ugly book called My Reasons for Rejecting God or something like that. I interviewed him for that book. I just updated that book to let people know that before he died, he apparently did come to faith. So that was a fun development to learn about, and the new edition has updates like that. But I did a book called The Case for Miracles. And in that book, I interviewed the #1 skeptic in the United States. His name is Dr. Michael Shermer. He's the founder and editor of Skeptic Magazine. Nice guy. He and I have become friends, and so I went out to California to interview him, and I brought up the topic of the Gospels, and this is what he said. He said that the Gospels are mythology told to make moral points. He said, quote, "In ancient times, the point of history wasn't to record what actually occurred. Rather, it was to make a point. What Jesus said and did in sequence wasn't really that significant to them." Now, we all know that's wrong, don't we? I mean, the Gospels do make moral points, but that doesn't preclude them from reporting actual historical events. The prevailing opinion of historians today is that the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do not fall into the category of mythology, the genre of mythology, like Osiris or Mithras or these ancient myths. They fall into the genre of ancient biographies. And ancient biographies were intended to tell what really took place. So how can we succinctly make the case for the reliability of the Gospels? I want to offer an easy-to-remember formula for how to do that. You all remember from elementary school learning about the vowels, A, E, I, O, and U, right? So I want to use those vowels as a way to remember A, E, I, O, U, 5 points why we can trust the Gospels as being reliable. So let me ripple through those. The first one, A, the letter A, stands for authorship. Stands for authorship. Now, the charge that you often hear from skeptics is, well, you can't trust the Gospels because they're anonymous. You can't even trust who wrote these things, so why take them seriously? But what's the reality? The reality is it is true that technically the Gospels do not explicitly disclose within their pages who the author is. But that's true of virtually every other writing from the first century as well. Plutarch wrote a couple of dozen biographies. He's never identified within the pages of any of those as being the author. That just was not the practice in the ancient world. As one scholar said, it would be like these days writing a song and putting your name in the song. Nobody would do that. It'd be kind of weird, wouldn't it? They just didn't put their names in the biographies that they were writing in the first century. In fact, one scholar was only able to find one example from that era where the name was apparent from the document. But all these others, including all of Plutarch, never mentions the name of the author. And it is possible that they weren't strictly anonymous. It is possible that there was a tab to the scroll with the name of the author on it, and that tab got lost or torn off over time. We don't know that. But there is good evidence that the Gospels were written by the people traditionally identified as the authors. That is Matthew, who was a disciple, Mark, who was the scribe of Peter, the eyewitness and the disciple, John, who was a disciple, and Luke. Luke is my favorite, because Luke is sort of a first century investigative reporter. You know, he wasn't one of the disciples, but he interviewed everybody and got the facts down. I thought, that's what I do. And so I like Luke. I can't wait to get to heaven and sit down with Luke. We're going to have a good time. But we do have points from ancient history where the authors are identified. So, for instance, in the year AD 125, Papias specifically says that Mark had accurately recorded Peter's eyewitness observations, that Matthew preserved the teachings of Jesus, And then in AD 180, Irenaeus confirmed the traditional authorship of all 4 Gospels. But here's the point. Never in history have any of those Gospels been attributed to anybody but the traditional authors. In other words, we don't have a single manuscript or historical report that attributes any of these Gospels to anybody else. If there had been confusion in the early world about who actually wrote these things, you would expect that one of them or more would be attributed to somebody else. We don't have that. And so what we can say with confidence is the uniform testimony of the early church affirms the traditional authorship. The uniform testimony of the early church confirms the traditional authorship. Now that means they're based on eyewitness accounts. Matthew and John were disciples. They were there. They witnessed these things. Mark was a scribe of Peter. So Peter told him his experiences that Mark then wrote down. And then Luke says, quote, he carefully investigated everything from the beginning so he could write an orderly account about the certainty of what took place. 2 Peter 1, verse 16 says, for we did not follow cleverly devised tales. We weren't following fairy tales when we made known to you the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses to his majesty. We saw these things. 1 John 1:1 says that we're writing about what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, and what we have looked at, and what we have touched with our hands. So this is real stuff. We saw it, we touched it, we experienced it. And then Peter and John, before the Sanhedrin, in Acts 4, verse 20, says, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. So they're stressing that these are eyewitness-based accounts. And yet, if you read them carefully, you see discrepancies or differences between the accounts. I don't call them contradictions. I call them differences between the accounts. Why, if they're all eyewitness-based, why do we have these differences? I was trained at Yale Law School. And at Yale's Law School, they taught us, if you have 4 witnesses who say the exact same thing, you raise the flag and say collusion. They got together, they figured it out, and now they're all just parroting the same story, and their credibility goes down the drain. If we had a car accident out here and all of us looked out the window and saw it, we'd all describe it slightly differently from your perspective, and yet we're describing the same experience. So it is, if you've ever covered, I've covered multiple trials, political corruption cases, business corruption cases, crime syndicate murders, and all this stuff. And so I've heard hundreds, if not thousands, of witnesses. And you expect some difference between the accounts of eyewitnesses. Otherwise, you get very suspicious. So the guy who made Harvard Law School what it is today, which is the second best law school, was a guy named Simon Greenleaf. And he wrote this about the Gospels. He says, there is enough of a discrepancy to show that there could have been no previous concert among them. In other words, no collusion among them. And at the same time, such substantial agreement as to show that they were all independent narrators of the same great tradition. So the fact that there are differences is a strength, not a weakness, of the credibility of the Gospels. And if you've done some study on these differences, you know that they can be harmonized, they can be dealt with, they can be harmonized. In fact, Michael Licona, in a book published by Oxford University Press, examined writings from that era, secular writings from that era, compared them to the Gospels, and concluded that if you account for the way in which ancient biographies were actually written in that era, and you take that into account as you read the Gospels, what you find is that all the discrepancies disappear. They disappear. I'll give you an example. If you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they we call the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they say that multiple women visited Jesus' tomb and found it empty. But John's Gospel is different. John's Gospel only explains Mary Magdalene going to the tomb. And so some people say, well, that just throws doubts on the Gospels. If Matthew, Mark, and Luke are saying multiple women went to the tomb, but John only says Mary Magdalene, isn't that not just a discrepancy, but a contradiction? And the answer is no. No. There's a common technique, not only in ancient writing, but we use it today. It's called spotlighting. And in spotlight, it would be like me going home and telling Leslie, say, hey, how was Virginia? I said, Virginia was great. I got to hang out with Dr. Bird. He's awesome. I love Dr. Bird. I wish he were my doctor. Now, that would be true, but I didn't mention all of you. Why? Because I'm spotlighting Dr. Bird. Doesn't mean I don't believe you were all here. Just means I'm talking about Dr. Bird because I wanted to spotlight him. And this is what we have in this example. John, even though he only mentions Mary Magdalene, is aware of the presence of other women while shining his spotlight on Mary. He says Mary announces, quote, they have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him. Who's the we? It's the other women. He's spotlighting Mary, but he's acknowledging that there were others with her. So my point is the apparent discrepancies can be explained, they can be harmonized. Some are more difficult than others, granted, but none of them cast doubt on the essential reliability of the Gospels. So the A vowel stands for authorship. Next vowel is E, A-E-I-O-U. The E stands for early dating. Early dating. The charge you hear from skeptics is, the Gospels were written so far after the life of Jesus that you can't trust them. Mythology and legend grew up in the interim, colored what was eventually written down. You can't trust it. The truth is, the reality is, the Gospels were written much closer to the life of Jesus than liberals suppose. How do we know? Well, we can look at the book of Acts and start there. The book of Acts ends with Paul being under house arrest in Rome. Now, we know that Paul was executed in the early 60s, but Acts doesn't mention that. Why? Because Acts was apparently written before he was executed. It ends with his house arrest, and so it must have been written before he was put to death, or they would have mentioned, by the way, he was executed. So that means that Acts, and by the way, there's several other things that happened in the 60s AD that are not mentioned in Acts. Things like the Jewish-Roman War in 66 AD, the deaths of Peter and James, which also took place in the 60s. So, Jesus was executed in 30 or 33 AD. I lean toward 30 AD, but scholars are a little split on 30 or 33 AD. So we know that the book of Acts was written before about 61 AD, so within 30 years of the death of Jesus. We know that Luke wrote the book of Acts, and we know that it's the second of a two-part series that he did. The first part was the Gospel of Luke. So we know the Gospel of Luke comes before 60 AD, because he wrote it before he wrote the book of Acts. We know the book of Acts was written before, say, 61 AD. So we have Luke written sometime before the book of Acts, probably sometime in the 50s AD. We know that Luke, one of his sources he draws from, is Mark. So we know that Mark was written before Luke, and so it takes it back even further. And we know that Mark draws on some even earlier sources, going back right into the 30s AD. And by the way, the creed I mentioned earlier in 1 Corinthians 15, dating back within months of the death of Jesus, which of course contains the essence of the faith. Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. He rose from the dead. Here's the names of eyewitnesses who encountered him. So the point is, the gap between the life and death of Jesus and when the gospel was written is smaller than most people think. So the verbal transmission before it was written down was much shorter than a lot of skeptics suppose. And keep in mind that, as the writers of the gospel eventually wrote this stuff down, their memories, all memories are not the same. All memories are not the same. If you ask me, Lee, what did you do on August the 12th 3 years ago? I have no idea what I did on August the 12th 3 years ago. But if you say, Lee, what did you do on August the 12th 50 years ago. I can tell you in great detail because that's the day I got married. When an event is unique, when it's unrepeated, when it's personally important or powerful, you tend to remember it longer. And much of what the disciples experienced falls into those categories, especially the resurrection of Jesus. And therefore, the memory is more likely to be fresh in their minds as they eventually wrote it down. So I don't think the dating of the Gospels really affects the reliability of what's contained in them. So AE, the I, stands for the integrity of the text. The integrity of the text. The charge we get is, hey, we don't have the originals of the Gospels. They disintegrated into dust, centuries ago, probably in the first century. As scribes copied those through the years, they made mistakes. They made errors. They even introduced some things on their own. And so it's impossible for us to know with any confidence what the original document really said. Scribes wrote them out they didn't have copy machines back then. So scribes would be writing these out by hand, and you're gonna make mistakes. And of course they did. But here's the reality. First of all, we have to take into account the proliferation of these ancient documents, so the copies that we have. We have far more copies of the Gospels and the New Testament than of any other ancient writing. Far more of these handwritten copies. We have about 25,000 to 30,000 copies of parts or the entire Gospels and parts of the New Testament. 25,000 to 30,000 of them, including 5,600 of the earliest, which are in the Greek. That's 3 times more than the Iliad, which was the Bible of the Greek world. The average Greek author has no more than 20 copies of his works in existence. Just 20. And they come from no sooner than 500 to 1,000 years after the original. And yet, here we have up to 30,000 of the ancient manuscripts and parts of manuscripts of the New Testament. And we have a fragment of the Gospel of John that's been dated back to within 30 to 40 years of the original. And that is incredible. Now, the textual criticism refers to the skill that's developed among scholars on how to analyze what the original document said by looking at all these later documents. It's a real art and a science to try to figure that out. For all other ancient literature, they rely on creative conjectures or imaginative guesses as to what the original said when they're trying to reconstruct the wording of the original. That's not true with the New Testament. Why? Because we have so many copies, we can compare and contrast them to try to determine what the original said. Now, there's an agnostic scholar by the name of Bart Ehrman. Anybody hear that name? Yeah. Ironically, Bart's mentor was a guy named Bruce Metzger. Bruce Metzger was the greatest textual critic, the greatest expert on the text of the New Testament of the 20th century. And in his book, Bart Ehrman credits Metzger as being, he said, everything I learned from Dr. Metzger. I interviewed Dr. Metzger before he died. And I said, based on your knowledge of the New Testament and the text in the Greek and so forth, has that increased your faith or decreased your faith? And he said, oh, it has increased my faith incredibly, given the proliferation of the number of documents that we have. It strengthened his faith. Now, Dr. Ehrman says he went the other way and says it weakened his faith. Why? Well, he points out, accurately, by the way, there are between 200,000 and 400,000 variants between the various New Testament manuscripts, differences between the New Testament manuscripts. 200,000 differences, or maybe as many as 400,000 differences. But that's only part of the story. The rest of the story is those variants are primarily spelling differences that make absolutely no difference to the meaning of what the text is trying to say. So, for instance, John, in the original, or in these copies of the manuscripts, sometimes John is spelled with one N, sometimes with two N's. Doesn't change the meaning. Doesn't change it to Mary, It's just the spelling. Between 70 and 80% of all these textual variants are spelling differences that are so minor you can't even translate them into English. They have zero impact on the meaning of the text. Only about 1% of the variants are both meaningful, which means they affect the meaning of the text to some degree, and viable, which means they have a decent chance of going back to the original. But when you look at that 1%, none of them involve key issues of what the Bible teaches. For instance, one of the ones that scholars wrestle with is Romans 5, verse 1. Did Paul say, we have peace, or let us have peace? There's only one letter difference in the Greek. But neither translation would be a contradiction to scriptural teaching. Another is 1 John 1, 4. It either says, thus we are writing these things so that our joy may be complete, or thus we are writing these things so that your joy may be complete. There's ancient testimony for both variants. So yes, the meaning is affected there, but it's not a foundational belief. So here's what we know for sure. The bottom line. By the way, as you look in your Bibles, you'll see the footnotes. It'll say, okay, here, some ancient manuscripts say it this way, some say it, it's all pointed out. There's no mystery about this. Here's the thing you need to know. Here's the key. Not one single cardinal doctrine of the church is jeopardized by any variance between the manuscripts. Not one. Not one cardinal doctrine is in jeopardy because of any variant. So it's a fascinating field of study, but it doesn't tell us that the Gospels can't be trusted. On the other side, the proliferation of documents tells us we can have greater confidence about the original of the New Testament than any other ancient writing. So A, E, I, and then O. Vowel stands for outside corroboration. Outside corroboration. The charge that you hear sometimes is, the Gospels report things that archaeology has not confirmed. And the example that was given, in fact, the guy whose debate I talked about that we did, the atheist who did that debate, said, he'd written an article saying, Nazareth never existed in the first century. There's no other ancient writer that mentions this place called Nazareth. So obviously the Gospels don't know what they're talking about when it talks about Nazareth. And so they'll use that kind of argument to try to cast doubt on the Gospels. But here's the reality. Over and over again, archaeology has shown the reliability of the Gospels. So, for instance, in 2006, archaeologists excavated underneath the Sisters of Nazareth Covenant in Nazareth, and guess what they found? They found a house from Jesus' era. So there's a first century house showing that Nazareth did exist in the first century, just as the Bible talked about. By the way, guess what they found in that house? Limestone pottery. Why is that significant? Because Jews of that day believed that food would not become impure if the pottery was limestone. And there are some who believe the house that they discovered was Jesus' house. We'll never know that for sure, but that would explain why a convent has now been built on that place, going back to Byzantine era. And it had the Jewish component. Who knows? Could be. But what we do know from that discovery is Nazareth did exist in the first century. And then, by the way, a few years after that, right down the block, they found another house from the first century in Nazareth. And so, time after time, we see critics who will raise these kind of objections only to have archaeology confirm the biblical reference. Another example, Luke 3, verse 1, talks about a guy named Licinius, who was a tetrarch of Abilene in about the year AD 27. Okay, so Luke's talking about this guy Licinius. He's a tetrarch, area called Abilene, AD 27. And for years, people would scoff at that and say, that just shows Luke doesn't know what the heck he's talking about. Licinius was not a tetrarch. He was a ruler of Chalcis half a century earlier. Cleopatra had him put to death. So they say this cast doubt on the accuracy of Luke. But then, a few years ago, an inscription was found from the time of Tiberius, which is 14 to 37 AD, that Licinius was tetrarch of an area called Abila near Damascus. In other words, Luke had it right. Turns out there were two guys named Licinius, and he was referring to the tetrarch. Luke was right all along. And we see this time after time. Also, we have non-biblical corroboration of Jesus. In other words, ancient writings outside the Bible that confirm things about the life of Jesus. Gary Habermas, I mentioned him this morning. He's probably one of the greatest, probably is the greatest resurrection scholar in the world. He's writing I think it's like a 5 million word treatise, like an encyclopedia, answering every potential objection to the resurrection. He's not quite done yet, but it's going to be monumental when it's published. Anyway, he wrote a book called The Historical Jesus. And in it, he details a total of 39 ancient sources documenting the life of Jesus, from which he enumerates more than 100 reported facts concerning Jesus' life, teachings, crucifixion, and resurrection. 24 of those sources, including 7 secular sources, and several of the early creeds of the church, specifically deal with the divine nature of Jesus. And so if you were to get rid of the Bible, and you were to look just at non-Christian sources from the ancient world, what would you learn about Jesus? Well, we know that Jesus was a Jewish teacher, that many believed he performed healings and exorcisms, that some believed he was a Messiah, that he was rejected by the Jewish leaders, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius, that despite his shameful death, his followers who believed he was still alive spread beyond Palestine so that there were multitudes of them in Rome by AD 64, and all kinds of people from cities and countryside, men and women, slave and free, worshiped him as God. That's what we would know just from non-Christian ancient sources. So there's corroboration that dovetails with what the Gospels tell us. So A-E-I-O, and then the U stands for uniqueness. Uniqueness. The charge that you hear sometimes is, you know what? There have been a number of alternative gospels that have been discovered in recent years. There's a gospel of Thomas. There's a secret gospel of Mark. There's the gospel of Peter, the gospel of Mary, the gospel of Judas, and they all ought to be treated equally with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, here's the reality. Yes, numerous gospels, I'll put that in air quotes, numerous gospels have been discovered since 1945. But none of them have the same first century eyewitness credentials as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, they're not really gospels, technically speaking. They are ancient documents. But they don't have the same eyewitness quality as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, they're not even really associated with the people whose names they bear. The best of them is the Gospel of Thomas. Thomas is a collection of 114 hidden sayings of Jesus. Now, some liberal scholars, like John Dominic Crossan, say, oh, Thomas is very early, and he dates it 50 to 70 A.D., which would put it back in the era of the true Gospels, trying to bolster its credibility. But that just falls apart when you analyze it. Why? Because the Gospel of Thomas shows familiarity with 14 or 15 of the 27 New Testament documents, which means that he was written after them, or quite late. It has material even from the Gospel of John in it. So how could it be written in the 50s and 70 A.D. when it has material from the Gospel of John that wasn't written down till in the 90s A.D.? Doesn't make sense. And get this, the Gospels were originally published in Greek. And then Christianity spread to other language groups. And it spread eastward, where people spoke a form of Aramaic called Syriac. But the Gospels weren't immediately translated into Syriac. In the year 175 AD, there's a guy named Tatian. And Tatian did something very clever. He took the 4 Gospels and he created a harmony of them. In other words, he took all 4 and kind of blended them into one. It was called the Diatessaron, which means through the 4. And in doing so, in blending these Gospels together, he created some unique forms, phrases, and so forth as he did that. Well, guess what? Those distinctive forms show up in the Gospel of Thomas. Therefore, Thomas, which is familiar with the order and the arrangement of the material in the Diatessaron, must have been dated after 175 AD. And so most scholars would date the Gospel of Thomas to 175 to 200 AD. That's a long time after the actual Matthew, Mark, Luke, John Gospels. And Thomas presents a different gospel. According to Dr. Craig Evans, who I interviewed, as I mentioned, written 40 books on historical evidence, professor at major universities, he said salvation in Thomas comes from self-knowledge, from understanding oneself and recognizing where one fits into the cosmos, as well as repudiating and not getting caught up in this world. Overall, it's slightly Christian, it's slightly Old Testament, it's slightly Gnostic in character. In fact, Dr. Evans said, if anything in Thomas does actually go back to Jesus, it's because it reflects authentic tradition already preserved in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Everything distinctive in Thomas turns out to be late 2nd century Syrian tradition. So this is an older document. It's contaminated by other worldviews that crept in over the time before it was written down, so far after the original. I mean, you think Jesus died in 30 or 33 AD, and Thomas wasn't written until at least 175 AD? That's far, far later, and as historians will tell you, the more generations that pass, the more contamination is introduced. Besides which, I don't know if you ever read the Gospel of Thomas. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to do it because it'll blow your mind. It's bizarre. It's totally bizarre. It's got all kinds of bizarre teachings. For instance, in the Gospel of Thomas, Simon Peter says, "Let Mary go away from us because women are not worthy of life." And Jesus says, "I shall lead her in order to make her a male, so that she too may become a living spirit, resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself male will enter into the kingdom of heaven." Does that sound like the Jesus we know from the 1st century eyewitness-based Gospels, who respected women, who elevated women? I don't think so. Yeah, it sounds like something from the 21st century, not the 1st century. Also in the book of Thomas, Jesus is quoted as saying, "Split the wood, I am there. Lift up a stone, and you will find me there." That's pantheism, that God is everywhere. God is in this podium. God is in this, Here's one of my favorite lines from Thomas. "If you fast, it will bring sin upon yourself. If you pray, you will be condemned. And if you give to charity, it will harm your spirits." Really? I mean, it's just, and some of the sayings are just totally inscrutable. Get this one. "Blessings on the lion if a human eats it, making the lion human. Foul is the human if a lion eats it, making the lion human." What? Seriously? What in the world is that supposed to mean? Some is just inscrutable. But the point is, none of these other Gospels that you read about have the same credentials historically as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're not tied to the apostles like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are. The dating is late. They're not consistent with the picture of Jesus we get from the more reliable 1st century documents. So how did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John get included in the New Testament? What were the criteria that were used? Well, basically 3 criteria. Number 1, apostolic authority. Was it written by an apostle or someone associated with an apostle? That's the first test. That's why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John pass that test. Second, and therefore they have eyewitness qualities because they're associated with an apostle. Second, conformity to the rule of faith. In other words, is the writing congruent and consistent with the teachings that the church found normative in that era? And then three, was there continuous acceptance and usage by the church at large? In other words, did the church embrace them immediately and consider them, elevate them to being Scripture immediately? Those are the kind of tests that are used to determine what qualifies to the New Testament. None of these other documents pass that test. So as I quoted Dr. Craig Evans earlier, I'll quote him again. He said, there's every reason to conclude that the Gospels have fairly and accurately reported the essential elements of Jesus' teachings, life, death, and resurrection. They're early enough. They're rooted into the right streams that go back to Jesus and the original people. There's continuity. There's proximity. There's verification of certain distinct points with archaeology and other documents. And then there's the inner logic. So, A-E-I-O-U, good way to remember why we can trust the Gospels and to respond to some common objections to them. But then I don't know if you remember in elementary school, they would say, yeah, the vowels are A-E-I-O-U and sometimes Y. Remember that? I never figured out, really, why? Why? And when why? I never quite figured that out. But the Y could stand for you. That's the word I would use for that. Why? You. How do you respond to the Gospels? How do you personally evaluate and apply the Gospels to your own life? What's your response to the case for the Gospels? I think that's a good way, if you ever do a teaching on this topic, to wrap that up. Say, now, what do you do with that? How do you respond to the case for the Gospels? Okay, so we want to do a little Q&A for a few minutes? All right? There's George has got a mic.
I got a mic.
Your mic is good, or you got a better voice than me.
Who's got a question?
Here's one. Let me guess. Libby. Yeah?
Thank you. Just a quick question. You mentioned that you tend to think Jesus was crucified in 30.
Yeah.
33. Could you expand on that a little bit? I've not heard that before.
Yeah. There's a dispute, not a dispute, but different evaluations, different analysis by different authors and scholars on which year. I mean, as I looked at the totality of the evidence, I just leaned toward 30. One of the reasons is the darkness that the Gospels report falling over the earth at the time of the crucifixion. And this is actually confirmed by a document in the year 221 where a guy named Josephus Africanus is commenting on an earlier document that was written by a scholar in the first century who did a history of the Eastern Mediterranean world about 70 AD, and who mentions the eclipse, or mentions the darkness, and tries to write it off as an eclipse. And Josephus Africanus says it couldn't have been an eclipse because of the timing of it. And there were some other things that happened. Like I'm doing this from memory, but I footnote this in the Case for Christ. There's also corroboration outside the Bible of the earthquake that took place as well. And so the darkness and the earthquake seem to point toward, I think, a more 30 AD date than 33. But a lot of people think it doesn't really matter, but it's interesting. But I think things kind of edge toward 30.
This isn't a question, but just a comment and maybe a challenge. That vowel rule was actually A-E-I-O-U and sometimes Y-N-W.
W?
Can you
How
come
did
up
he
with
get
something
in there?
for W?
Come on.
Can you come up with something for us for W?
Yeah, the W stands for what the heck? Is Z going to be next? What about Q? I like Q. Are you serious? That W can be a vowel? I never heard that. That's hilarious. Yeah, I think it stands for what the heck. That's very funny. Apparently, there's an elementary school teacher back there. Yeah, George running.
Let me get rich, and then we'll come back over here. I like to see the pastor run, don't you?
Yeah.
You were talking about discrepancies before.
Yeah.
Some people are confused as to what the specific day of the week that Jesus was crucified on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a can of worms. Here's why. There are those who say, wait a minute, the teaching was that Jesus was dead for 3 days. There's 3 days between his crucifixion and his resurrection. Well, wait a minute. If he was crucified on Friday and was resurrected on Sunday, how do you say he was resurrected after 3 days? And so some people say, well, therefore, he was maybe crucified on Wednesday. And therefore spent all of Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, 3 days before he was resurrected. In my book, The Case for Easter, I actually footnote this. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I remember it. I remember now. There's a Jewish word, onah, O-N-A-H. And what that refers to is the belief among first century Jews that any part of a day counted as the whole. So the quote is from, I think it's a Babylonian Talmud. The quote is, an onah is a portion of a day, and any portion of a day is considered as the whole. So that Jesus was crucified on Friday, that's a portion of Friday. He's in the grave Saturday, he's resurrected on Sunday. There you have an onah portion of it, and therefore that's where the 3 days come from. So that's how I look at it. And I think that's how the majority of the churches looked at it. There are some very vocal people that want to claim that he was actually crucified not on Friday, but earlier. And they make some arguments for it. I don't think it's very strong.
This time I have a question. Which Bible translation is the closest to the original? Because we have so many different ones.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When you say closest to the original, that gets a little snarky because, you don't want a word-for-word translation because English and Greek are two different languages. And so it would be nonsensical to read it. You wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of it. So all translations to some degree are dynamic in the sense that they're trying to determine what does this word mean, what's the context, and so forth. And there's a number of translations which are very close to each other that I trust and that I use. I use the NIV. I got 130 scholars that put that together. They're pretty darn good at figuring it out. I use, and my publisher publishes NIV, so they kind of push me toward NIV. But I like the NIV. But there's other good ones. The Baptist just came up with a good one. What was that called? The Holman Christian Translation, I think it's called. That's pretty darn good. But I'll tell you a new one that came out that I really, really, really like. It's called the Net Bible, N-E-T, the Net Bible, New English Translation. And it was a project headed up by Daniel B. Wallace of Dallas Seminary. Dr. Wallace is probably the leading expert on Greek, I think, in our generation. And he got a team together and put together this translation. Now, what's interesting is that they have like 2,000 footnotes in this translation. So that when there's a question, do we go this way or do we go this way? There's a footnote saying, I could have gone this way for this reason. I could have gone this way for this reason. Here's what I chose and here's why. That's pretty helpful. So if you remember from this morning, I quoted from the Gospel of John, where Jesus said, I and the Father are one. And in that translation, you would see a footnote, and it would say, this word for one is not masculine, it's neuter. That means Jesus was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in essence. We're one in nature. And the audience got it that he was claiming to be God. That's in a footnote in the NET translation. That's really handy stuff. And so I really, really like that. You can get it online, but the online version does not include the footnotes. So Dan Wallace, because he's a friend of mine, gave me the actual translation, and it's about that thick because of all the footnotes. But if you can get a hold of that, I find that to be the most helpful current translation. But there are other good ones too. Which one? You were saying, what do you like to use? Yeah, right. You're a pastor. What do you like?
I like to study out of the NIV and the ESV, but I teach out of the NLT.
I love the NLT. This is not the Living Bible paraphrase. The NLT is a translation, but it's very readable, don't you think? It's a little more conversational. To me, it comes alive more than the NIV a bit. The ESV is another great one.
Now, this year devotion, I'm reading through the message.
Yeah, now the Message and the Living Bible, these are paraphrases, but sometimes these are by wonderful people. Eugene Peterson was awesome. My son was mentored partially by him. And so when they do a paraphrase, they breathe their experiences into that. And it's not literally accurate in terms of the text itself, but it brings another dimension, and it's beautiful. And the Message is a beautiful example of that. The Phillips, remember the old Phillips translation was another one, or paraphrase. So there's a bunch of them. I would not recommend the, what's the name of the Jehovah's Witness translation? What is it? Yeah, the New World. I would stay away from that, yeah. That's been demonstrated to be inaccurate in many, many ways. But, depending if you're doing scholarly research versus just pleasurable reading, you might want to switch it up and read a paraphrase, like read the Message for a season and get a broader, deeper, personal, interpretive account. And then the NIV or the, maybe as a more deeper, or the NET as a more deeper scholarly experience.
Fantastic. We're going to take a break right there and give you a
By the
chance
way,
to...
can I say one other thing? This is really fascinating. Daniel B. Wallace, a guy I mentioned who did this translation, who's the leading expert on Greek. He's written the book that's used in every seminary to teach Greek. So Daniel B. Wallace, great guy, nice guy, got a brain infection. I think it was encephalitis or something from a mosquito bite or something. Anyway, Daniel B. Wallace, after he did all this writing on Greek and all this stuff, lost his memory. At one point, he didn't know who his wife was. He lost his memory. He had to learn everything over again. And guess what happened? The second time, he also became the greatest expert on Greek. He had to relearn the whole thing, which tells me some people have a facility for language, right? For some people, they can learn a foreign language, but can you imagine not learning it once and become a world-leading expert, but doing it all over again? And he lives up in Dallas. He's a great guy. I interviewed him for my book, In Defense of Jesus. Anyway, I thought you'd like that, the anecdote.
Yeah, fantastic. We're going to take a break for 10 minutes, stretch your legs, get something to eat, and we'll come back to wrap it up.